Hi, and welcome back to Romeo and Juliet. Now that we've gone over a pretty detailed summary of the play in part 1, let's get into the analysis. Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy that Shakespeare wrote sometime between 1591 and 1595. The story isn't a Shakespeare original, though. The sources that inspired him most directly were Luigi da Porto's newly found story of two noble lovers, as well as another Italian tale that was translated into The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet by Arthur Brooke. But stories of ill-fated lovers come from a long tradition, dating back at least to ancient Greek myths. And Romeo and Juliet doesn't seem to have lost any of its appeal to this day. It's still played in theaters and it's been adapted in other forms plenty of times, including in The Sims 2. If you'd like to see a performance of the play on YouTube, I can recommend the 2009 production at the Texas Shakespeare Festival, directed by Kevin Otos. As for the movie adaptations, which there are a few of, I confess I only watched one, the 1968 one directed by Franco Zeffirelli, which I can recommend. I'm mentioning it now also because I'm going to talk about some interesting things that they did in that movie throughout the video, although of course I'm basing my analysis on Shakespeare's play first and foremost. So the Sims we're going to look at in relation to the play are Contessa, Consort, Tybalt, Juliet, Patrizio, Isabella, Mercutio, and Romeo. But before we get into the character analysis per se, there's a few things we need to address pertaining to the older characters and the dynamics within the rival families. As you've probably noticed, this video is quite long. We're going to get to the juiciest parts of the feud, but I'm not jumping into that right away because I want to be very thorough. By going from the basics to the more speculative stuff, I'm hoping that you'll take things away from this video regardless of how much you already know about Veronaville's lore. And I hope that you'll share your insights as well and that you'll let me know if there's anything that I missed. With that said, let's get into the first part of our analysis. In Romeo and Juliet, it seems like there's quite a gap between the younger generation and the older generation. The way the characters are presented, they kind of either fall in the impetuous young'uns category or in the old people category. There isn't much of an in-between. The younger generation includes Juliet, Tybalt, Romeo, Benvolio, Mercutio, and Paris, while the older generation includes Lord and Lady Capulet, the nurse, Lord and Lady Montague, and Friar Lawrence. And it's not just about numerical age, it's mostly a difference in mentalities. For instance, Lady Capulet isn't technically old at all. She says she had Juliet before she was her age, so before she was 13. So now that Juliet is 13, nearing 14, she must be about 26. So she's technically not old, but the way she's coded definitely puts her in the old people category. For example, when Lady Capulet sees her dead daughter in the final scene, she says, "The sight of death is as a bell that warns my old age to a sepulchre." She's not even 30. This seeming inconsistency might be explained by a comment that Lord Capulet makes early on when Paris comes to him to ask for Juliet's hand. Lord Capulet is probably thinking of his wife when making that reply. The 1968 movie makes that explicit by having him say that right after looking at her. And the other members of the older generation have plenty of references to their age in the text. In the starting scene, when Lord Capulet wants to join the general fight and he asks to be brought his sword, Lady Capulet replies, which is pretty savage, I like it. Then during the Capulet party, Lord Capulet talks to his cousin about how they're too old to dance. And Lord Montague makes a reference to his own age in the final scene when he arrives at the graveyard and says, there'd be a bunch more examples, but you get the gist. The reason I'm talking about this is because this is somewhat mirrored in The Sims 2 with Consort, Patrizio, and Isabella being the household heads in their elderly age. The generation of Romeo and Juliet's parents is completely out of the picture because they're all dead. Killing off that middle generation could have been a way to reproduce this seemingly large age gap between the younger and the older generations in the play. The Sims elders resemble the parents of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet more closely than Cordelia, Caliban, Claudia, and Olivia would, and so that's probably why it's Consort, Contessa, Patrizio, and Isabella who were most likely inspired by Lord and Lady Capulet and Montague, while the middle generation has nothing to do with the play. Lord and Lady Capulet, Lord and Lady Montague don't have first names, or their first names are never brought up, so that's why I'm not saying outright that they are the definite counterparts of these 4 elderly Sims, but I mean the chances are high, and I'm pretty sure that's the consensus among the Sims 2 community. So that's why I use Consort, Contessa, Patrizio, and Isabella as Romeo and Juliet's parents in the summary video, even though they are their grandparents in The Sims 2. If you've seen the previous episodes of Shakespeare and Veronaville, you already knew that Maxis completely disregarded the original Shakespearean family trees and did their own thing instead. I think the most striking examples of that we've seen so far are in Much Ado About Nothing, where Beatrice and Benedict are lovers, Hero gets married to Claudio, and Antonio is Hero's uncle. But back to our elders. The name Isabella refers to the Isabella from Measure for Measure, so Isabella Monti could be a combo of that Isabella and Lady Montague. The names Contessa, Consort, and Patrizio don't appear in any of Shakespeare's plays. The developers came up with them themselves. Contessa is Italian for countess. The Caps are a matrilineal family, which is why the Cap women all gave their names to their husbands, the Cap founder being Cleopatra. So Contessa having such a noble, important name seems fitting. Consort has a very interesting name actually. A consort is the spouse of a ruler, which makes sense given that Contessa is supposed to be the head of the family. Consort is from the Thebe family, which is also a matrilineal family. You can see that Andromache is the one who gave her name to Hector. A consort is also an associate, which is the exact word that the devs use in Consort's bio to describe his relationship with Patrizio when they were younger. Consort Cap was once associates with Patrizio Monti, so that's a nice touch there. And this is kind of small and probably irrelevant to be honest, but the word consort in the sense of a music band appears in one scene of Romeo and Juliet. It's in the conversation between Mercutio and Tybalt leading up to Mercutio's death. Mercutio, thou consorts with Romeo. Consort? What? Dost thou make us minstrels? And thou make minstrels of us, look to hear nothing but discords. Here's my fiddlestick, here's that shall make you dance. Dance, consort. It's a small thing, but I think it would have been nice if Consort could have had music as his predestined hobby. But the way the game assigns predestined hobbies depends on the Sim's personality and interests, and Consort's personality and interests dictate that his hobby is science, not music. So that's unfortunate, but oh well. Then the name Patrizio is Italian for patrician. The patricians were the members of the all-male noble order in ancient Rome, basically the ruling class. Etymologically, patrician comes from the Latin pater, the father. Unlike the Caps who follow matrilineal inheritance rules, the Montis are a patrilineal family. Patrizio is supposed to be the head of household, and his heir will preferably be male. Or that's the idea, of course, you can do whatever you want with your game. If you're interested in following the rules of real-life primogeniture for the Caps and the Montis, the Sims Wiki has a section dedicated to that on both families' pages. The links are in the description, but the rundown is this. For the Caps, now that Contessa is dead, her eldest daughter Goneril should technically inherit the Cap estate and fortune. After Goneril's death, her eldest daughter Miranda should succeed her. When Miranda dies, her eldest daughter should be the heiress. And if Miranda dies without a daughter, Goneril's second daughter Desdemona becomes the heiress, and her eldest daughter after her. If Desdemona dies without a daughter, her younger sister Ariel becomes the heiress, and then if Ariel dies without a daughter, you'd have to look at Regan's daughters and then Cordelia's daughters. To be honest, when I play Veronaville, I tend to view Juliet as the Cap heiress, just because she's from the main Cap household and she's a family sim, and then I go down the line of her daughters. And as we just saw, that's not how it should work at all, but Goneril starts the game in the family bin, and I really don't feel like having her move into the Cap manor, because having her household struggle out of poverty without relying on the Cap fortune is just too much fun. Now for the Montis, Antonio should be the heir after Patricio's death, then his son Benedict, then Benedict's first son, and so on. If Benedict dies without a son, the heir should be the eldest son of Patrizio's second son, Claudio, so that should be Mercutio. I think that's a mistake there. Mercutio should be number 3 because he's older than Romeo. And then if Mercutio dies without a son, Romeo becomes the heir. Again, these are just the rules that would apply in real life, but do with them what you will. Now that we have a clear view of the feuding family's background, let's get into the character analysis and discussions around the feud. Lord Capulet is the member of the older generation who's the most fleshed out in the play. Unlike Consort, he's the head of his household and the one making decisions, while his wife is more in a support role. Although he seems committed to his family, we get a couple indications that he has romance sim tendencies, or at least he definitely did when he was younger. During the party at his house, he says, "Once there was a time when I could wear a mask and charm a girl by whispering a story in her ear." Then, when the household is preparing Juliet's wedding with Paris, the nurse tells Lord Capulet to let the servants take care of it and go to bed because he's going to damage his health staying up so late. And he says, No, not at all. I've stayed up all night before for less important reasons and never gotten sick from it. Lady Capulet replies, "Yes, you were a woman chaser in your time, but I'll keep an eye on you to make sure that you don't stay up for those reasons anymore." After she exits, Lord Capulet says in frustration, "She's become a jealous woman, a jealous woman." He's also not the most understanding father. After Romeo is banished, he gets very annoyed with his daughter crying so much over what he thinks is Tybalt's death. Then he shows no sign of compassion when Juliet refuses to marry a man she basically doesn't know when she's not even 14. His frustration escalates to outright abuse towards Juliet, and his wife, and especially the nurse, speak up against his behavior, which he doesn't take kindly to. Lord Capulet clearly has anger management issues. If you remember the system of the four humors that we talked about in the episode on the Merchant of Venice, he's definitely a choleric. I found that interesting because I don't know about you, but before reading the play, I always viewed Consort as a very stern, very cold man, uptight and proper, very demanding of himself and others, and not prone to showing any intense emotion like anger. And I know that in reality, his autonomous behavior will lead him to get into physical fights with the Monties because of how the game works. But I don't know, in my head he wouldn't stoop to that level. His hatred would be expressed in more subtle ways, maybe using his power as an influential businessman to apply economic or political pressure on the Monties. And let me know what you think about that, because I'm sure that many of you have a different interpretation, but I think this impression that I get comes from the aesthetics that Maxis gave to the caps. Look at the Cap Manor, for instance. It looks very cold, traditional, not particularly inviting. I suppose the four fireplaces have to bring a bit of warmth, but to be honest I find them pretty disturbing considering that Consort's daughter and her husband died by fire. There aren't any plants inside the house and the vegetation outside is very manicured, controlled. The manor itself was built very far back into the lot, away from the road and the passers-by, which contributes to the Cap's aura of unapproachability. Consort also looks pretty intimidating. He's fit and his face is emaciated to say the least. Contessa's face as well, and their children's to a lesser extent. And they're all unambiguously white and pale, like they're not getting much sunlight. That of course has to do with the fact that they live on the English side of the neighborhood, inspired by Shakespeare's hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon. In Romeo and Juliet, the Capulets don't give that impression at all. Part of that is because, unlike Maxis, who associated the Caps with English aristocracy, Shakespeare anchored the Capulets in Italy and he relied on stereotypes about Italians. A passage that's particularly telling is in Act 3, Scene 1, when Mercutio says to Benvolio, "Come now, you can be as hot-blooded as any man in Italy." And yeah, none of the characters in the play are nearly as cold as I perceive Consort Cap to be. I mean, extreme passion is one of the central themes. And Lord Capulet definitely ascribes to the hot-blooded Italian stereotype. He likes women and he's prone to anger. So overall, even though Consort is probably supposed to be partly inspired by Lord Capulet, they arguably convey very different vibes. But I don't think that's a bad thing at all. Consort's characterization and the whole Cap aesthetic work quite well in the game. Instead of focusing only on the universe of Shakespeare's plays, the devs also took inspiration from the context that Shakespeare lived in real life, and they created their own lore from there. That might be why the Caps are a matrilineal family, by the way. Shakespeare's England was ruled by a woman, Queen Elizabeth I, so it's only fitting that the English side of Veronaville should be ruled by a woman as well. I also like that the Cap residence is called the Cap Manor because the word manor doesn't only refer to a house. In England, it was also the name given to an estate under a lord enjoying a variety of rights over land and tenants, including the right to hold court, and that seems quite appropriate for the Caps. I think I have even more appreciation for the world building that the devs did in Veronaville after realizing that the Caps are very much based on an original concept and not a simple recreation of Shakespeare's Capulet. Consort is a fortune sim with a very high interest in money and politics. He's a CEO, which is rank 9 of the business career. When you load up the household for the first time, he has a want to retire. I take it to mean that he'd like to be more available for his grandchildren now that he's their only carer after Contessa's recent passing. For that reason, I'm inclined to give him family as a secondary aspiration. Consort is very neat, on the shy and serious side, and very grouchy. He's a Scorpio with a description that says, while somewhat withdrawn from social activities, Scorpios are forceful and determined in more practical pursuits, which aligns quite well with the cold, stern businessman interpretation of his character. For all it's worth, I think Lord Capulet would have the family aspiration with a secondary romance, and his personality would look something like this, very outgoing and rather playful. For all their differences, Lord Capulet and Consort do have one thing in common, their antagonistic relationship with the patriarch of the rival family, so let's talk about him. The play doesn't spend nearly as much time with the Montagues as it does with the Capulets, and so Lord Montague isn't nearly as developed as his Capulet rival. The most we see of him is after the big fight of Act 1 Scene 1, when he and his wife wonder where Romeo is and why he's been so sad. We can deduce that the couple are not very close to their son, or at least he doesn't trust them enough to confide in them about his heartbreak, which is understandable. Luckily, there is much more to say about Patrizio Monti. Like Lord Montague, he's the head of his household. Although he's a family sim, he isn't particularly close to his two grandsons who live with him, Mercutio and Romeo. The boys' parents, Claudio and Olivia, only died fairly recently, so they must have moved in with their grandparents recently as well, which could explain it. Patrizio has a pretty good relationship with his wife Isabella, on the other hand, but they don't have a crush on each other, even though they would both be in range. This might mean that their marriage has become stale or turned a bit sour, which is corroborated by the way they seem to be arguing in the Monty household picture. Although it's worth noting that they're still in love. You can't see the red heart on their relationship panels because it's hidden by the wedding ring symbol, but they do have a memory of falling in love with each other, and if you have them interact romantically, they'll regain their crush but not their love, because they never lost it. So it's not like their relationship is bad, I don't think, and it doesn't take much to reignite the spark. When it comes to Romeo's relationship with Juliet, Patrizio and Isabella don't seem to be aware of it, the same way that Lord and Lady Montague don't know anything either in the play. Patrizio and Isabella both have Juliet in their relationship panel, but they don't view her as an enemy like they do other Caps, so maybe they've just seen her around, but they don't suspect her involvement with their grandson. Or maybe they do know and they don't care, who knows. That's a bit less in the spirit of the feud, but it's always a possibility. Patrizio is neat, and a bit on the lazy, serious, and grouchy side. His astrological sign is Sagittarius, with a description that says, jovial and carefree, Sagittarians are also blessed with boundless energy. Unfortunately, this combination can make them restless and careless. I really can't say if this would fit Lord Montague as well. I really think Maxis did their own thing with Patrizio because, like I said, the play doesn't give us much about Lord Montague. When you start the game, Patrizio is only 2 days away from dying of old age. He recently retired from the culinary career. There's something weird in his memories, several things weird actually, but in particular, he remembers getting promoted 3 times after retirement. I don't think there's any way to make sense of this other than to say that it must be an oversight. Patrizio was promoted a bunch of times over his life. Both his very high interest in work and his bio confirm that he's a hard worker. His bio reads, through his hard work, Patrizio has become the Don of llama ranching, but will his grudge against Consort Cap prevent him from enjoying his legacy? You might have noticed that despite being high up in the culinary career, Patrizio doesn't have any points in cooking. I think his bio gives a possible explanation there. He worked on a llama ranch, so the connection with culinary would be that he was raising llamas for their meat. Call me naive, but that never occurred to me before doing research for this script, so maybe Patrizio was only involved with breeding and raising the llamas, and not at all with the cooking part, or maybe he was in some kind of management position, so he wouldn't need to have any cooking skill. I personally tend to erase anything to do with animal agriculture from my headcanons, but do with this what you will. Like Consort, Patrizio is also very interested in money and politics. As I mentioned earlier, Consort's bio tells us that he and Patrizio used to work together, which makes sense given those common interests. Consort's bio says, Consort Cap was once associates with Patrizio Monti, what led to the end of their relationship, and can it now be salvaged? So as far as we know, it's the falling out between Patrizio Monti and Consort then Thebe that caused the rivalry that would later be known as the feud between the Montis and the Caps, once Consort became part of the Cap family. The main Monti household description gives us an additional piece of information as to what happened between them. Patrizio Monti never forgot Consort Cap's broken promise. So basically Consort and Patrizio used to work together. Then Consort broke a promise he made to Patrizio, and that's when their mutual hatred started. Consort and Patrizio's memories confirm that they used to be best friends, then lost each other as best friends, and if you look at their relationship panels, they are now enemies. The notion that they used to be associates, which I understand as meaning that they were business partners, shows up in Patrizio's memories. You can see that he met Consort when he was a teenager, then he got a job. You can imagine that they started business together. They became best friends, and the job thing was going well, and then he and Consort had a falling out, and he got fired. Now, Consort's memories are more iffy on that. Consort remembers meeting Patrizio and becoming best friends with him, not as a teen, but as a child. And this would be consistent with their current ages as elders. Patrizio is on his 9th day as an elder, while Consort is on his 3rd. In that case, when Patrizio got his job, Consort would have been a child and therefore could not have been his business associate at that time. This is probably an oversight. In any case, the safest bet is probably to trust the bios and hold that Consort and Patrizio were indeed business partners for some time, which this picture of them in an office setting also corroborates. Now the elephant in the room, Contessa. A couple things indicate that the falling out between Consort and Patrizio may have been over Contessa. Their memories show that they both met her, and Patrizio had his first kiss with her, right before they lost each other as best friends. Then Patrizio got fired, Consort had his first kiss with her, and Consort and Contessa got married down the line. We also have this picture of Patrizio and Contessa making out and Consort looking on, which suggests that there was something going on there. Consort definitely knew that Contessa was involved with Patrizio, so this may suggest that both Patrizio and Consort liked Contessa. Contessa first dated Patrizio, Consort didn't take it too well, something happened, and in the end Contessa left Patrizio and went with Consort instead. Maybe the promise that Consort broke had something to do with Contessa. Although Contessa Cap may have been inspired by Lady Capulet in Romeo and Juliet, their backstories are quite different. Lady Capulet married Lord Capulet very young, and they had Juliet when she was at most 13 years old. On the other hand, we know that Contessa had some time to acquire some relationship experience with Patrizio before she settled with Consort. Unlike the Caps, the Capulets don't seem to follow a matrilineal tradition. Lord Capulet definitely has a dominant position over his wife, and Lady Capulet is rather submissive, whereas Contessa is the one in a position of power in her household, as the first sentence of her bio shows. Contessa is a strong matriarch who can hold a grudge. What they do have in common is their hatred for the rival family. Lady Capulet isn't just some passive set piece of the feud, she harbors a deep resentment against the Montagues that she's willing to act on. For instance, after Tybalt's death, she publicly asks the prince for a Montague to be put to death in return, and when she thinks that the reason Juliet is inconsolable is because Tybalt was killed, she says that she sent a message to a man she knows in Mantua to ask him to kill Romeo with poison. I skipped over that in the summary because her plan doesn't pan out and isn't even mentioned after that, but it shows how involved she is. Unfortunately, we never get to know why exactly she hates the Montagues so much, just like we have no clear answer as to why Contessa holds a grudge against the Montis. Because even if Contessa is the reason why Consort and Patrizio became enemies, what reason would she have to hate the Montes? There's no indication anywhere that Patrizio ever did her dirty back when they were together or before she got married to Consort. Unless I'm missing something, in which case I really hope someone will let me know, because that would definitely be interesting. I think it's likely that she only started hating them after she married Consort and the Montes started retaliating against Consort's offense. Maybe she became resentful after the Montes killed some of her relatives who died in suspicious ways. We're gonna come back to that. In The Sims, Contessa died recently when you start the game. She died as an elder, and her ghost indicates that she died of old age, but the thing is, when you look at her file in SimPE, it tells you that she was 2 days younger than Consort when she died, which means that she had only been an elder for 1 day. Even if she aged up in aspiration failure, which might have been the case after her daughter's death, she couldn't have died of old age while that young, through normal gameplay. Of course, Maxis probably didn't anticipate that SimPE would be a thing and that players would have access to her precise age at the time of her death, so it might not be significant, but if it is, it makes her death a bit suspicious. There's a possibility that she killed herself or died of grief after her daughter's death, in the same way that Lady Montague died of grief following Romeo's banishment in Romeo and Juliet. Or maybe Contessa was a casualty of the feud. Strangely, Bianca Monti has a memory of Contessa's death, which should not be the case since they're not related. What's even weirder with Bianca's memories is that she has a negative memory of Contessa's death and a positive memory of the death of her own brother, Claudio. Maybe this was a bit of a fumble and it's the memory of Contessa's death that should have been the positive one, in which case Bianca may have killed Contessa in the context of the feud. It's a theory that we'll explore more in a future episode when we talk about Bianca. Conversely, if we hold Contessa's cause of death as a reliable piece of information, I think Romeo and Juliet gives a possible explanation as to why she was still so young when she died, and that would be Lord Capulet's remark that girls who have children very young grow up too quickly, referring to Lady Capulet. This could literally mean that she lost her childhood and never got those years back. Contessa's death of old age while she was still so young could be a reference to that. Although that's a bit dubious because, as I said, unlike Lady Capulet, Contessa did not marry or have children at a particularly young age as far as we can tell. Contessa is a fortune sim with a hidden family token. She has a very high interest in money and no interest in work at all. This brings me to a theory regarding the feud that I think is very plausible. Maybe Consort and Patrizio's falling out had nothing to do with Contessa. Maybe Contessa was dating Patrizio while his business with Consort was doing well, then Patrizio and Consort had their falling out over a broken promise unrelated to Contessa. Patrizio lost his job as a result, and Contessa left him because of that. Maybe she didn't want to stay with a guy who, in her eyes, had become an unemployed loser. And then, since Consort happened to still be a successful businessman, she set her sights on him, simply because he was a much better prospect. And you can see how this relates to her aspiration and interests. She's money-driven, but she hates work. So maybe she was looking for a husband that she could rely on financially. Maybe Contessa is Veronaville's Dina Caliente, what a ton of events. Or alternatively, Contessa was forced into a marriage with Consort by her parents, in the same way that Lord and Lady Capulet wanted to force Juliet to marry Paris. The Cap and Thebe families are much more compatible than the Caps and the Montes when it comes to hetero marriages, because the Caps and the Thebes both follow a matrilineal tradition. Even if Contessa had wanted to marry Patrizio, their parents might have been against it because their positions within their marriage would have clashed. So an alliance with Consort was not only advantageous financially, it also made sense politically. If you remember the episode on The Merchant of Venice, we talked about the possibility that Bassanio Monti was responsible for the death of Julius Caesar. This is because Bassanio could have been partly inspired by Brutus, Portia's husband, a man who was instrumental in the assassination of Julius Caesar both in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar and in real life. If that's the case, then it's understandable that Contessa's parents would oppose her marriage to the heir of her grandfather's killer. And of course, the assassination of Julius Caesar could also have planted an early seed of the feud. Corny Regan explored the scenario of an arranged marriage between Contessa and Consort in a brilliant article she wrote on the beginning of the feud. It will be linked in the description, and I highly recommend you read it if you're interested. If you don't have the time to read the whole article, I would encourage you to at least read the section towards the bottom of the page that sort of synthesizes everything into a coherent narrative of how the feud may have played out. It's a fun read, she did a really good job. Contessa's personality is nothing extreme. Her main trait is her seriousness, and she's a Scorpio like Consort. That leads me to think that she might not have required much convincing from her parents if they're the ones who told her that a marriage with Consort would be the most reasonable choice. Or if her parents weren't involved in her decision, it's also easy to imagine that she would choose him over Patrizio if she was driven by logic and reason rather than pleasure. As a Dina fan, I do like to imagine that Contessa's choice was entirely her own and that she's a bit of a gold digger as well. If you look at Contessa's genetics in CPE, it says that her hair was black before she became an elder, but in this screenshot and in The Sims 3, she has blonde hair, so that's why I decided to give her blonde hair. The same applies for Consort. He has the genes for black hair, but he's blonde in screenshots and in The Sims 3, so I made him blonde, graying because he's coded as an aging man. And Patrizio has the genes for brown hair, and he has brown hair in The Sims 3, but his hair is black in the screenshots. So I arbitrarily decided to go with the screenshots and give him black hair, graying as well. On the topic of hair, I'd like to apologize for a mistake I made in the vid on the Two Gentlemen of Verona. Proteus is supposed to have brown hair. I gave him blonde hair by mistake. That's my bad. Lady Montague is the character of the older generation that we see the least in the play. She even dies off stage before the final scene from the grief caused by Romeo's exile. In The Sims 2, Isabella Monti is still alive, and it's Contessa Cap that is dead when you start the game, which, as I said, could make a case for Contessa passing because of her grief over Cordelia's death. We've talked about Isabella already relative to her namesake in Measure for Measure, but there's still quite a bit that I didn't touch on in that video. According to their memories, Isabella met Patrizio when she was a teen and he was an adult. This is consistent with their age difference when you start the game. Patrizio is on his 10th day as an elder, while Isabella is on her 2nd. They met after Patrizio and Consort became enemies. By that point, Patrizio had already moved on from the business world and joined the culinary career. After they got married, Isabella got a job in culinary as well, and like her husband, she was promoted a bunch of times before she retired. Isabella has 10 points in cooking, and her bio emphasizes her cooking skills. Isabella's culinary talents have long been the cornerstone of the Monty clan, but will her secret recipe for the perfect baked Alaska heal old family wounds? So unlike Patrizio, Isabella is a proper chef. I've mentioned this before, but the whole Monty clan has many members in the culinary field, and I think that's an integral part of the aesthetic Maxis was going for with the Montys. While the Caps look like austere English aristocrats, all pale and skinny, the Montys have a much warmer vibe. They live on the Italian side of town, where their houses are Mediterranean-style villas that contrast with the Tudor architecture of the English side. The Monty Ranch looks quite colourful compared to the Cap Manor. It has many plants and that cute little lawn flamingo that I'm sure Consort feels utmost contempt towards. The interior decor of their houses in the Sims franchise is generally pretty sparse and color-free to optimize performance, I believe, but here the devs still put some mess in the boys' rooms that gives a feeling that the place is lived in. There's also an unpainted wall in the games room and a light fixture missing in that empty room at the back, which are probably oversights, but hey, maybe not. Maybe that wall was only built recently when the boys moved in and they haven't had time to finish painting it, and that small room might be in the process of getting furnished. There's movement and change, things aren't perfect, and that's okay. Again, stuff that Consort would never tolerate in his home. The Montys also look less intimidating than the Caps. Their faces are rounder and softer. Like I said, they seem to enjoy food, which relates to pleasure and abundance, as opposed to the Caps' aura of austerity. I was curious to see the proportions of thin, fit, and fat Sims in both families, looking at their whole family trees, and here are the results. Both families are majority thin, but the Montys have many more fat members, while the Caps have many more fit members. Even freaking Ariel is fit. Did you know that toddlers could be fit? The two families also differ in terms of skin tones, with the majority of the Caps being skin 1, while the Montys are mostly skin 3. So they're in a position with each other down to their aesthetics, physical appearances, and genetics. Going back to Isabella, her position in the feud isn't really detailed in the game. She considers the vast majority of the Caps that she knows as enemies, but we're not given a reason why she would hate the Caps personally, kind of like Contessa. So maybe she simply adopted Patrizio's stance, or as I said, maybe the case for Contessa, she developed her own grudge over the years of back and forth attacks from both parties. I believe Isabella played a very active part in the feud when she burned Cordelia and Caliban alive. I'm sorry that I don't have a better build-up to that piece of information, but I mean, here it is. We know that Cordelia and Caliban, Contessa and Consort's daughter, and her husband died in a fire, and then the game makes a point of associating Isabella with fire. That can't be a coincidence. Her bio talks about her secret recipe for the perfect baked Alaska, which is a dessert that you're supposed to put on fire, from what I understand. We also have that picture showing her putting said dessert on fire, and if you watch the culinary channel on TV, there's a program that shows Isabella doing some cooking, putting the stove on fire, and dying in the flames. There's a lot of unexplained deaths in Veronaville, but I'm pretty confident that the deaths of Cordelia and Caliban are rather straightforward. Isabella did it. Her personality is very balanced, but it's worth noting that she was assigned the astrological sign Aries, even though she doesn't technically have the personality of one. Aries people are described as such, dynamic and confident. Most Aries never shy away from the opportunity to strike up a conversation with anyone. However, they can be somewhat impulsive and quick-tempered. If she's indeed impulsive and quick-tempered, it's very possible that she killed Cordelia and Caliban in a fit of rage. Now, I don't know if she would kill them just as retaliation against Consort breaking his promise, whatever that promise was. I think the feud had already started escalating by the time Cordelia and Caliban died, but we'll explore that in future episodes. What I like about fire being the weapon Isabella used is that I think it can be connected to the character of Isabella in Measure for Measure. In the play, Isabella is a very devout Christian nun. This is dark, but if you look back at the history of Christianism, plenty of people were killed by fire in the name of the Christian God, for being heretics, for being witches, etc. So I don't know if Maxis intended to make this association, but regardless, it works. And the deaths of Cordelia and Caliban, followed by the death of Contessa, could have prompted the Caps to retaliate by killing Olivia and Claudio Monti, which was followed by the death of Hero. There's a perfect parallel there that really feeds into the theme of the endless cycle of revenge, an eye for an eye, a dead for a dead. It's brilliant. Alright, let's move on to the younger generation now. In the play, Juliet is not yet 14 years old. She's the only child that the Capulets have left after their other children died of unspecified causes. In The Sims 2, Juliet's parents are dead and she has two siblings, Tybalt and Hermia. There's a family picture showing the whole family back when Juliet and Hermia were still toddlers and Cordelia and Caliban were still alive. There's some inconsistencies in the Caps' memories regarding the birth order of Juliet and her siblings, but if we go by their actual in-game ages, Tybalt is the eldest, confirmed by the picture, Juliet is the second child, and Hermia is the youngest. By the way, if you ever wondered why the windows in that picture are facing the wrong way, I think it's actually a reference to the medieval windows that had shutters on the inside. I learned that was a thing after I saw this window set by Lama at the medieval smithy. So yeah, that's a very nice touch. On the topic of age, according to Romeo and Juliet's memories, when they met, he was a teen and she was a child, which might be a nod to Juliet's young age in the play. But it kind of contradicts this picture of the Cap and Monty teens from when they were all children that shows who are likely to be Romeo and Juliet interacting. So maybe there was a bit of a fumble with Romeo's memories and he's actually supposed to remember meeting her as a child. Juliet is only 1 day younger than Romeo. She has a memory of falling in love with him as a teen, but she's not in love with him in her relationship panel. Even weirder, she remembers acquiring her second best friend, who has to be Romeo, after falling in love with him, which doesn't make much sense. so I think it's safe to say that the fell in love memory is an oversight and it shouldn't be there. If you follow the scripted event at the Monty household when you load the lot for the first time, Romeo will invite Juliet over and want to make out with her. But if you ask him to make out with her directly, without improving their relationship first, she will deny him, because that long-term relationship isn't high enough yet. I think this might be a reference to the balcony scene in a way. If you remember that scene from part 1, Juliet shows that she's very much in love, but she also shows restraint. At one point she cuts the exchange short, or shorter than Romeo would like it to be, and bids him goodnight, arguing that this is all wonderful, but things are going a bit too fast. Romeo is disappointed and says, "Are you going to leave me so unsatisfied?" And then he says that what he means by that is that he'd like them to exchange vows of love, so he wants them to be engaged. But before he says that, there's a moment of doubt where Juliet and the audience get the suspicion that what he means is to have sex with her right away. And as a director, you can have your actors played that way. You can have Romeo really mean that what he wants is just sex, at least in that moment. But then when he sees that Juliet wouldn't appreciate that, he course corrects and starts talking about marriage so she doesn't get angry with him. Because obviously, if they were to have unmarried sex, Romeo wouldn't really suffer any consequences as far as I'm aware because he's a man, but Juliet's life would be ruined. As we've talked about before in this series, at that time, a woman who is not married, nor a virgin, nor a widow, is basically at the very bottom of the social respectability ladder. Juliet knows that very well. She's young but not naive and definitely not stupid. And both she and the nurse too very much have in mind that she absolutely needs to be married to Romeo before they go further. And I think that this carefulness on Juliet's part is mirrored in the Monty scripted event, in the sense that if Romeo doesn't properly woo her before initiating a makeout, she will push him back. Juliet isn't there to fool around. She's a family sim who needs some commitment from Romeo before she's willing to go further, exactly like she is in the play. Not that there would be anything wrong with just fooling around, but that's just not what Juliet wants. And you can already start to see the aspiration mismatch between these two, because Romeo is a romance sim, which typically comes with commitment issues. For context, at that time, girls of Juliet's social class in Italy had 3 possible life trajectories: become a nun, become a prostitute, which was frowned upon, or most commonly, get married, have kids, and be a housewife. Once she meets Romeo, Juliet definitely wants that third option for herself. She wants to become his wife. Juliet's parents clearly destined her to become a wife as well, but not the wife of any man. As much as Lord Capulet tells Paris that he cares about his daughter's opinion, he later reveals his true colors when she refuses to marry Paris and he forces her to anyway. Juliet isn't remotely free to do what she wants, in general. She seems to be very sheltered, which makes sense given her age, but I mean it's almost like she's cloistered in her home against her will. She doesn't have the freedom to get outside her house like boys do. The only times she's able to get out is when she says she's going to confession, otherwise she has to rely on the nurse to carry messages for her. She also doesn't seem to have any friends outside of her household. You can also tell what the men's perception of women is from the things they casually say. For instance, after Mercutio's death, Romeo says that his love for Juliet has made him weak and effeminate. Then when Romeo has a mental breakdown when he's told that he's been banished, Friar Lawrence tells him, "Your tears are womanish." And he's back at it again later with Juliet when he gives her the vial of potion and tells her not to let her womanish fear abate her resolve. To that last one, Juliet replies, "Don't talk to me about fear," and she takes the vial. I love how Olivia Hussey played that scene in the Zeffirelli adaptation.
Give me. Tell me not to fear.
And then when time comes to drink the potion, Juliet is scared. Of course she's scared. She's about to lose control of her body for 42 hours and be put in a tomb with the remains of her ancestors, with no guarantee as to when Romeo will be able to get her out. She's 13 years old, but she overcomes her fear and drinks the potion anyway. Juliet is fierce, and she subverts people's expectations of her. She doesn't ascribe to the typical submissive role that was associated with womanhood. During the balcony scene, she says that she should act more hard to get with Romeo, like respectable women do when they're being courted, but she can't help being passionate and full of life, which makes it all the more heartbreaking when her extreme passion ultimately leads to her death. At the end of the play, even the Capulet and Montague elders pity her and praise her faithfulness once they learn the full story. In The Sims 2, Juliet's bio reads, Juliet loves her family and wants to please them, but her feelings for Romeo are undeniable. Can she make her family proud and make herself happy as well? The element of fierceness isn't mentioned, but otherwise this bio makes sense in relation with Shakespeare's Juliet. At the start of the play, Juliet comes off as polite and willing to please her parents. Then she meets Romeo, she has to choose between her family and her own happiness, and she chooses herself. In The Sims 2, the player is presented with the same dilemma. Should Juliet submit to her family's expectations or follow her own desire to be with Romeo? I'm pretty sure most people have her pursue the relationship with Romeo, at least for a time, but you could totally go the other way, maintain the status quo and disallow any mixing between the Cap and Monty bloodlines even. Juliet Cap has the family aspiration, like I said, and she's slightly sloppy, rather outgoing, lazy, and playful, and slightly grouchy. I think this fits the Juliet from the play as well. If I allowed myself to go beyond 25 points to match Shakespeare's Juliet even more closely, I'd maybe add 1 or 2 points in active, but otherwise it checks out. Juliet was assigned the sign Cancer with a description that says, there is nothing extreme about Cancers, they are very balanced. They can also be very changeable, which can be good or bad depending on the situation. This might make her seem a bit boring, until you realize that actually she has the personality of a Taurus. The typical Taurus is strong-willed and determined. That can often mean determined to have a good time. Well, there you go, strong-willed and determined, prioritizes her own fulfillment and happiness. That's our girl. To be honest, before making this episode, I did tend to find Juliet Cap kind of boring, like a blender version of Angela Pleasant, but I hope that if you felt that way too, you now have a better appreciation of her potential as a character. I really do. I think she definitely has the shoulders to carry the Cap family legacy, whether it's with Romeo at her side or not, and honestly, she's one of my favorite Sims now. In the play, Romeo is Lord and Lady Montague's only son. In The Sims, Romeo's parents are both dead and he has a brother, Mercutio. Romeo and Mercutio are best friends, although their short-term relationship is rather low for some reason. Them being close would definitely make sense when you look at their relationship in the play. At the start of the play, Romeo is very infatuated with Rosaline, and then he instantly forgets about her as soon as he lays eyes on Juliet, which explains why Maxis made him a romance sim. Shakespeare doesn't paint Romeo as a one true love type knight in shining armor, he's just a young guy who's subjected to the changing currents of his passions. And that's pretty cool. I think it's much better characterization than the more sanitized version of him that I had in mind before I read the play. And it's no wonder I had that impression, because subsequent adaptations of the play frequently removed Rosaline from the story entirely, or downplayed Romeo's infatuation with her. In the 1968 movie, they removed the part where Romeo tells Benvolio about his love for her at the start of the play, and it ends up making a pretty significant difference for him as a character. To be honest, I much prefer Shakespeare's original version. I think it makes the play less cheesy and way funnier. During the balcony scene, Juliet says to him, "Please don't swear by the moon, the unreliable moon which changes its position in the sky each month. I do not want your love to end up being similarly variable." If you remove Rosaline, this just sounds like a regular romantic thing to say, but if you know that Romeo's love has already changed quite drastically since he moved on from Rosaline to Juliet from one moment to the next, Juliet saying that has a different ring to it. When Romeo goes to Friar Lawrence to ask him to marry him to Juliet, Friar Lawrence is a bit shocked by how quickly Romeo's affections have switched targets, and that's quite funny as well. The Sims 2 really embraced that side of the character. Romeo's Sims 2 bio says, "Naturally charismatic and handsome, Romeo's on his way to becoming quite the heartbreaker. Will he meet his match in Juliet?" He does have 3 points in charisma, by the way. You could definitely interpret Shakespeare's Romeo as the romance aspiration type as well, but to be fair, it's not necessarily the whole picture. Romeo doesn't look at any other girl after meeting Juliet, and I mean, he does drink deadly poison to be with her in the afterlife. Had they been able to live together in Mantua, he might have been a faithful and committed husband to her. I think giving him a family secondary aspiration, or even giving him a complete aspiration change at university, for instance, wouldn't run counter to Shakespeare's Romeo's characterization. Something that stands out to me about Romeo is that he's a pretty decent person, I guess. Underwhelming, I know. He's presented as having pretty good morals. For example, he gives money to people that are poorer than him, to the nurse, to the apothecary, and to Balthazar in the final scene. He is getting something in return from these people, but we get the feeling that he's generous beyond what's expected of him in each of these situations. Then, after he's married to Juliet, he really doesn't want to duel Tybalt, and he tries his best to de-escalate the fight that ends up resulting in Mercutio's death. It's very unfortunate that it's precisely his attempt to separate the two that results in Mercutio getting killed, but as he says, he tried to do what was right, it was an accident. At Juliet's tomb, when Paris confronts him, Romeo tries to tell him to go away and to convince him that he didn't come to be disrespectful to the dead. After he kills Paris, which he's sorry he had to do, he grants his dying wish to be laid in the Capulet tomb next to Juliet. And then in the vault, when he sees all the Capulet bodies displayed in open caskets, as is tradition, he asks Tybalt's corpse for forgiveness. This shows that he never truly wanted to kill him, and only did it in a fit of anger over Mercutio's death. In The Sims 2, Romeo is on the sloppy side, a little bit outgoing, a little bit nice. He's an Aries, but with the personality of an Aquarius. Friendly and amusing, Aquarians are excellent companions. Being well balanced in other areas helps to make them the most agreeable sign. I think Romeo's balanced personality would fit Shakespeare's Romeo, but if you look at him in various situations in isolation, then not really. What I mean by that is that, for instance, when he's with Juliet, he's very serious and melodramatic, whereas when he's with Mercutio, he's much more playful and dirty jokes come to him very naturally. At the start of the play, he's very withdrawn, but later on, he's much more sociable and often found hanging out with his friends. And it still makes for a coherent character, I think. It just shows that he's still young and subjected to strong emotions that visibly impact his behavior. But there isn't any way to reach that degree of subtlety in The Sims 2, so I guess this personality would have to do. As I said, I'm not sure that Shakespeare's Romeo would necessarily have the romance aspiration like Romeo Monty does, but again, since he's a bit of a chameleon, it's hard to tell. I find Romeo to be the hardest character of the play to pin down, despite spending so much time with him in the past weeks. I wish I could reach a more definitive stance on him, but maybe the main takeaway is precisely that he's quite changeable. Hopefully, I've given you enough elements that you're able to draw your own conclusions and maybe have a clearer picture of him in your mind than I do. So now that we've gone over both Romeo and Juliet, I thought we could look at how compatible they are as romantic partners from the game's perspective. To determine how much chemistry there is between two Sims, the game looks at several things: their aspirations, their zodiac signs, their personalities, and their turn-ons and turn-offs. And then there's some other things like the genie's beauty wish or the je ne sais quoi vacation benefit, but we're not concerned with that here. I'm also not going to talk about turn-ons and turn-offs actually, because pre-made Sims get randomly generated ones, so the Romeo and Juliet in my game aren't going to have the same as in yours. By the way, the turn-ons and turn-offs in the vanilla game are kind of broken if you have certain expansions installed. There's a mod on MTS that fixes that, made by Tuna is a Fish. I put the link in the description. It's only relevant if you don't use custom replacements, of course. So first off, their aspirations. Romeo is a romance sim, while Juliet is a family sim. These are quite incompatible, so they'll get a fat penalty to their chemistry there. Then if you look at the zodiac signs that they were assigned, they are incompatible again. Cancer repels Aries and vice versa. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think those signs are the ones the game is taking into account to calculate their chemistry score, and not the signs that actually match their personalities. And then their personalities are fairly similar, so that score should be good. But overall, Romeo and Juliet do not have much chemistry. Remember that the chemistry system came with nightlife, so it probably wasn't something that the devs had in mind when they created these sims. So I don't think their poor chemistry should be taken as the devs telling us that these two definitely are not made for each other, even if in practice, if you have nightlife, it might make a difference. What the devs did have in mind, no doubt, is their compatibility when it comes to their interests, because interests were in the base game and have nothing to do with chemistry. And Romeo and Juliet do have very similar interests, as you can see. The only notable difference is that Juliet has a very high interest in school and no interest in sci-fi, while Romeo has a moderate interest in both. So that means that they will rarely ever have a bad conversation. So there you go. I hope this maybe clarified some things about how Romeo and Juliet interact in your game. And if you've been playing Veronaville, I'd be curious to know how the relationship between these two has evolved for you. And if you have mods like ACR or similar 90s romantic standards, that might also introduce more variables that could influence their relationship. I'm sure that can make for interesting stories. In Romeo and Juliet, Tybalt is Juliet's cousin. They don't seem to be particularly close. Actually, we never see them interact over the course of the play. When Tybalt dies, Juliet is initially outraged, but her grief is quickly overshadowed by her feelings for Romeo. We don't have much info on Tybalt's other relationships. We know from the party guest list that he has a cousin named Valentio, but that's it. His parents are never mentioned, and none of his friends are fleshed out. In The Sims 2, Tybalt is Juliet and Hermia's elder brother. Unlike his sisters, who have a few friends each, Tybalt only has one friend, his grandfather Consort. Romeo and Mercutio Monti are his enemies, of course, but he has rather negative relationships with Cap members as well. He might not be the easiest person to get along with. That picture of the Cap and Monti teens as children that I brought up earlier shows Tybalt being mean to Mercutio. I mean, this picture speaks for itself. Tybalt was already a menace back then. In the play, Mercutio describes Tybalt as such. He's more than just the Prince of Cats. Oh, he does everything according to convention. He fights like you sing printed music, carefully keeping the correct time, distance, and rhythm. He rests when it is proper to rest, 1, 2, and the third in your heart. He's a master duelist who can hit any of his opponent's buttons that he chooses. He's a gentleman who learned at the finest fencing school, and he's skilled at identifying insults and slights his honor so that he's forced to fight. So he refers to Tybalt as being the king of cats, and later also calls him a rat catcher. This is a reference to the character of Tybalt from the Tales of Reynard the Fox. The Tales of Reynard the Fox are fables originating from 12th century France, featuring anthropomorphic animals as allegorical representations of human society. The main character is Reynard the Fox. He's a trickster and a liar, sort of an anti-hero. Then there's others like Isengrim the Wolf and Tybalt the Cat. Initially, Tybalt is an ally of Reynard, but then Reynard tries to trick him for his own amusement, and from there, Tybalt becomes just as mean-spirited as him. And the tricks he pulls on Reynard are quite successful from what I've read. Reynard has really found a match in him. So Mercutio isn't insulting Tybalt's intelligence when he calls him the king of cats. If anything, it's a comment on his agility and talent with a sword, but also on his viciousness. And apparently it's also a reference to the Italian word cazzo, which is not a nice word to call someone. Tybalt's main traits are his pride and his short temper. Like his uncle, Lord Capulet, Tybalt is clearly a choleric. He doesn't tolerate being disrespected, and it doesn't take much for him to feel disrespected. For example, the mere presence of Romeo at the Capulet party sends him into a rage, and he later wants to challenge Romeo to a fight just over that. In The Sims, Tybalt hates the Monties with a particular zeal. Just look at his face, this guy looks permanently angry, I love it. His bio says, outspoken but surly, Tybalt is proud to carry the Cap name, while his pride and hatred of the Monties ruin his sister Juliet's chance for happiness with Romeo. Pride and hatred, yep, fits him like a glove. The scripted events at the Caps and the Monties really drive that home as well. The event at the Cap Manor is probably a reference to the Capulet party, which might be why Tybalt has face paint on. He's wearing a party mask. Romeo is there, and when you prompt Juliet to interact with him romantically, Tybalt and Consort are supposed to react negatively. At least that's how that scripted event is supposed to play out, although it seems that it doesn't trigger anymore if you have the ultimate connection. In any case, Tybalt considers Romeo an enemy, and he will autonomously be mean to him. Although in the play Lord Capulet tolerates Romeo's presence at the party, Consort also considers Romeo an enemy, and he's likely to harass him as well. So that's a slight variation on the play's dynamics there. Then if you follow the scripted event at the Montes and you have Romeo invite Juliet over, Tybalt will come along with her, looking for a fight. If you keep Romeo busy with Juliet, Tybalt will probably have a fight with Mercutio, who has a fear of losing a fight against him. Tybalt will pretty much always win the fight because he has 10 body points while Mercutio has none, and Mercutio will go into aspiration failure, and that has to be a reference to Tybalt killing Mercutio in the play. I think it's pretty well done. And so now we know why Tybalt has 10 body points. It's because he's supposed to be a good fighter and beat Mercutio up. In The Sims 2, Tybalt is a popularity sim. I think this fits Shakespeare's Tybalt as well. Tybalt cares about his honor a lot. I take that he wants to be respected, admired. That seems to be his main drive. In the scene where he comes to Mercutio looking for Romeo, he has a bunch of Capulet friends at his side. He's not a lone wolf. I don't know that he's a good friend necessarily. He's probably kind of an asshole, let's be real, but he's still a social person. Sims 2 Tybalt is outgoing, a bit on the serious side, a bit on the active side, and grouchy. He has the personality of an Aries, as Juliet does, but he was assigned Gemini. Youthful and lively, many think Gemini have enough energy for two. Also energized by conversation, it isn't surprising to find them bouncing from one topic to the next at parties. Shakespeare's Tybalt is maybe a bit more serious and a bit more active, but overall it's a match. So now that we know Tybalt better, let's play armchair psychologist for a minute if you'll allow me, because this young man here definitely has some issues that need to be unpacked. When you start playing Veronaville, his aspiration is low, he's a popularity sim with basically no friends, he's doing poorly in school, and he's evidently struggling to contain his murderous impulses. His bio implies that the reason why he hates the Montes so much is because he's very, I want to say, patriotic when it comes to defending his family, and so that's why he's inclined to perpetuate the feud. He just doesn't want to let it go. And when you look at the whole younger generation of Veronaville, by which I mean all teens and younger, Tybalt is really the only one who's determined to keep this feud alive. Everyone else seems to be ready to move on. Romeo and Mercutio do consider Tybalt as an enemy, but not because he's a cap, it's more likely that it's simply because he's a dick to them. Romeo and Mercutio both have crushes on Tybalt's sisters, so the conflict between the two families doesn't benefit them at all, and they probably want it to end so they can pursue those relationships more openly. Tybalt, on the other hand, well, it's like he's holding on to some archaic code of honor that says that trying to resolve differences peacefully is equivalent to showing weakness. Maybe Tybalt wasn't born in the right era, if that makes sense. He's not on the same page as his peers, and he doesn't seem to get along with any of them, really. Hermia's bio sums it up pretty well. She often wonders what rock her brother Tybalt crawled out from under. Tybalt is kind of at odds with the way the world is evolving around him. It's not uncommon to feel out of place as a teen, but it's generally not to that extent, and generally not in this way, where you have more in common with the older generation than with your own. He also remembers growing up badly twice, which hints that it's not just a regular angsty teen phase that he's going through. Weirdly, both memories come after the deaths of Cordelia and Caliban, which would mean that he was a toddler when they died. This makes no sense when you remember this picture, and also when you compare his memories to his sister's memories. Hermia, who's the youngest sibling, remembers being a child when their parents died, and Juliet remembers being a teen. Tybalt being the eldest, he had to be a teen as well. The order of his memories in the vanilla game seems to suggest that he grew up badly as a result of his parents dying, but as I just said, that doesn't make sense on the timeline, so assuming that his memories of growing up were indeed supposed to be negative, there had to be other reasons for his unhappiness. He remembers learning his toddler skills from his parents, seems like he was well cared for growing up, which is coherent with the extreme pride he takes in being a cap. He and his sisters also go to private school, which again shows that his family is investing in them. So if we are to believe that he was doing badly even before his parents died, we need to resort to some theorizing to explain why that might be. My proposed theory goes like this. Tybalt grew up constantly hearing Consort's version of the story of the start of the feud, and that fostered a deep-seated resentment in him. He might have come away with the view that the world outside of his home is treacherous and evil, with all those Montes that are out to get you. Maybe he started to be very insecure as a result, and he became extremely protective of his identity as a cap, as a clutch, to the point of developing a hypersensitive fight response to perceived threats. Then when both his parents died, unnatural deaths, he immediately came to the conclusion that the Montes did it, which I imagine Consort and Contessa also believed. When you look at it this way, his behavior and his feelings are not surprising at all. Whether that's how it happened or not, he's convinced that his mom and dad were burned alive by the evil Montes, who were already undermining his family up until that point. If the deaths of Claudia and Olivia were orchestrated by the Caps as retaliation after the deaths of Cordelia and Caliban, Tybalt could even have taken part in the plot in an effort to satisfy his need for revenge. Juliet and Hermia don't seem to hold the same views as him though. Maybe they were raised differently, which seems a little strange to me because even though they're technically not likely to be Cap heiresses based on IRL primogeniture, Tybalt is even less so since he's a man and the Caps are matrilineal. So you would think that if the family was going to try to teach their kids to love their own and hate the Montes, their focus would primarily be on the girls. But maybe Juliet and Hermia are a bit rebellious, like Juliet Capulet is in the play, and they're also younger than Tybalt, which might play into it. They might be more naive about the world. And then of course they both see the Montes through rose-tinted glasses because they have crushes on Romeo and Mercutio. They might not even believe that the Montes are responsible for their parents' deaths. So we have a pretty clear divide between the members of the main Cap household here. On the one hand, Consort and Tybalt want to perpetuate the feud until there's no Monty left to fight, and on the other, Juliet and Hermia have no interest in it continuing and they just want to live their lives in peace. Which will you, the player, choose? Oh my god, I can't stand the dramatic tension. If murder was a legit interaction that existed in the game, I think Veronaville could have rivaled Pleasantview in popularity. Alright, that's all I had to say about Tybalt. Moving on to our last character / sim, who's definitely not the least, Mercutio. Mercutio is a bright, flamboyant character, very witty and memorable. He doesn't have a filter and doesn't seem to care what people think. To the nurse, Romeo describes Mercutio as a gentleman nurse that loves to hear himself talk and will speak more in a minute than he will stand to in a month. Mercutio does talk a lot and he's very good with words too. He has a fantastical imagination, but he's maybe also a bit mentally tortured. The tirade he has right before the party at the Capulets when he talks about Queen Mab is the best example of that. His description of Queen Mab goes like this. She's the fairy's midwife and is no bigger than the stone on the ring of a city councilman. She rides her carriage, which is pulled by tiny little creatures, over men's noses as they lie sleeping. The wheel spokes of her carriage are made of spider's legs, its cover is made of grasshopper wings, and its harnesses are made of the smallest spider webs. The horse collars are made from moonbeams, while her whip is a single cobweb attached to a cricket bone. With this magnificent carriage, she rides each night through the brains of lovers, who then dream about love. She rides across courtiers' knees, who then dream about bowing and curtsying. She rides over lawyers' fingers, who then dream about their fees. She rides over ladies' lips, and they immediately dream of kisses. But Queen Mab often puts blisters on their lips because their breath smells of candy, which angers her. Sometimes she rides over a courtier's nose, and he dreams of sniffing out a way to make money. Sometimes she tickles a priest's nose with the tail of a pig given as a tithe to the church, and he dreams of getting a high-paid church position. Sometimes she drives over a soldier's neck, and he dreams of cutting the throats of foreigners, of breaking through fortifications, of ambushes, of the finest quality Spanish swords, and of huge mugs of alcohol before suddenly waking, frightened, by the sound of drums in his ears. Then he says a prayer or two and goes back to sleep. Mab is the one who tangles the hair of horses' manes at night, tangles which, if you undo them, bring bad luck. Mab is the hag who gives dreams of sex to virgins and teaches them how to bear the weight of a lover and to bear a child. She's the one, and then Romeo cuts him off. Calm down, Mercutio, be calm. You're talking about nothing. I think Mercutio might be a fellow neurodivergent. The 1968 movie interpreted him in that vein, I think. You see it in the Queen Mab tirade, and also before the fight with Tybalt, when Mercutio gets into a public fountain and bathes and plays in it to cool himself. He's very larger than life. His coping mechanism would be humor, and he's good at it. He sometimes uses humor to be mean though, like when he taunts Tybalt, who to be fair kind of deserved it, or when he makes fun of the nurse when she comes to talk to Romeo. That's another scene that was played up in the 1968 movie, where Mercutio comes off as quite cruel and mean-spirited. That's one way to interpret him. We talked about how he compares Tybalt to Tybalt the cat from the Tales of Reynard. If you play up his mean streak like the 1968 movie did, then maybe Mercutio is like Reynard himself. In The Sims 2, Mercutio's bio reads, "Good-natured and warm, Mercutio is the joker of his family. Can his good humor smooth the feuding family's ruffled feathers?" This bio doesn't really match Shakespeare's Mercutio character. He is a joker, but he's not really good-natured and warm. Like I said, he's more the tortured soul kind. With that said, a couple elements outside of his bio hint that there's another side to Mercutio Monti's easygoing demeanor. First off, when you start the game, his aspiration level is quite low. It's not surprising, considering that both his parents and his aunt died recently. He's also not doing too well in school, despite being decently interested in school, and that could also be attributed to grief. However, Mercutio's memories show that he was doing badly even before those deaths. He has 2 memories of growing up badly, and nothing much to balance it out. Romeo grew up well, but I doubt that this is a case of Romeo being the golden child while Mercutio was neglected. Mercutio remembers being potty trained by his mom, while Romeo doesn't remember being taught any toddler skills. Mercutio has a part-time job as a drive-thru clerk, which is level 2 of the teen culinary career, and getting to that level would normally require 1 point in cooking, which Mercutio doesn't have. This could be a mistake by the devs, or it could mean that his family pulled some strings to get him there. So the cause of Mercutio's consistently low aspiration levels may not be a lack of support from his family. So why has he been doing so poorly? The game doesn't give a definite answer as far as I know, but in light of Shakespeare's play, I'm inclined to attribute his ill-being to mental illness and or neurodivergence. Of course you can be mentally ill or neurodivergent and not have a miserable life, but it's not uncommon to be having a bad time when you're young, at least before you've figured out a few things. I can definitely attest to that. So yeah, my interpretation of Mercutio Monti is I see him as someone who's very witty, funny and creative, but who also has difficulties fitting in and finding fulfillment in the world he lives in. His Sims 2 personality says that he's sloppy, outgoing, active, playful, and a little grouchy. He has the personality of a Libra, but he was assigned Sagittarius, like Patrizio. Jovial and carefree, Sagittarians are also blessed with boundless energy. Unfortunately, this combination can make them restless and careless. This description matches Shakespeare's Mercutio quite well, with an asterisk on jovial and carefree. Shakespeare's Mercutio, I think, would be very outgoing, very active, very playful, and grouchy, like this. He would have to have extreme traits. He's not measured or restrained. I said that Tybalt was quick-tempered. Mercutio sort of is too. In the scene of his fight against Tybalt, Mercutio is the one who initiated the duel, while Tybalt was only concerned with Romeo. So when Mercutio blames the Capulets and the Montagues for his own death, saying, "May a plague strike both your houses," well, that's a bit disingenuous. Technically, Mercutio is the one who caused his own death by trying to defend the honor of Romeo when Romeo didn't even want him to. That's a turn of events that Shakespeare introduced to the tradition of Romeo and Juliet, by the way. Earlier versions of the story did not include Mercutio's intervention there, or they did not include Mercutio at all. In Arthur Brooks' Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet, for instance, Tybalt simply attacked Romeo directly and Romeo killed him in self-defense. Shakespeare introducing Mercutio into the scene adds a bit more subtlety to the character of Tybalt, in that he comes off as less aggressive. He doesn't draw his sword until Mercutio challenges him. The way I see it, there are at least 2 ways to play that scene. You could have Tybalt and Mercutio genuinely fight to the death, and Tybalt taking advantage of an opening created by Romeo's intervention to get the kill. The other way would be the way the 1968 movie played it, which I drew inspiration from for the Submarine Part 1. The way they played it, Mercutio and Tybalt aren't actually trying to harm each other. It looks more like a show of skill, where the goal is to assert dominance. And they both seem to be having fun until Romeo intervenes and Tybalt accidentally stabs Mercutio in the chest. So in that interpretation, it was just an accident. Whether you see it one way or the other has implications on the characters of Mercutio and Tybalt. I like the second interpretation because it gives the sense that these are just teenagers who happen to be equipped with potentially deadly weapons, but teenagers nonetheless. They get carried away and accidents happen. It's believable, it feels real. Sims 2 Mercutio is a popularity sim, which I think would work for Shakespeare's Mercutio as well. Pretty much for the opposite reasons that I gave for Tybalt though, but I think it still works, funnily enough. Mercutio doesn't care about people's opinion. I don't think he's looking to be surrounded by people who admire him, like Tybalt would. He just needs people to bounce ideas off of. Maybe that makes him a bit of an egoist, and yeah, I guess he is. I mean, if your mind is constantly brimming with thoughts and it doesn't give you any peace, I think it makes sense that you'd be spending most of your time focused on that. Mercutio is from the house of Aeschylus, so he isn't necessarily supposed to play a role in the feud, but in practice, he's an ally of Romeo and he despises Tybalt, so it makes sense that Maxis would make him a Monty. Aside from that, he has a brother named Valentine, again, that we never see. He seems to spend most of his time with his friends. He doesn't have a partner or crush or anything. The only instances he talks about women are to complain that Rosaline has caused Romeo to change for the worse, or to make fun of the nurse in a pretty viciously misogynistic way. And related to his misogyny, I think Mercutio is possibly queer-coded. In The Sims 2, he has a crush on Hermia Cap. Hermia is a character from A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is a play that features the world of dreams and fairies and other supernatural elements. Mercutio's Queen Mab Tyrid suggests that he has an affinity for the supernatural and the realm of dreams, so his attraction to her makes sense. It's kind of a shame that Sims 2 Mercutio doesn't have a higher interest in paranormal, or at least sci-fi. Kind of a missed opportunity there, I think, but oh well. Hermia has a crush on him too, but she also likes Puck Summerdream, who is also a character in Midsummer Night's Dream. Mercutio is friends with Miranda Cap, who has a crush on him, but he doesn't have a crush on her. That's another potential partnership between a Cap and a Monty, so that's pretty cool. I'm not sure why Miranda has a crush on him. She doesn't need to have a reason, obviously, but in The Tempest, Shakespeare's Miranda falls in love with a guy who is decidedly not like Mercutio, and he loves her back, so I can't say if this unrequited crush has any ties to Shakespeare. I'm not seeing any right now, but we'll explore that when we take a proper look at Miranda. Maybe it was just an opportunity that Maxis saw to introduce another bridge between the feuding families, as well as a love triangle. Love triangles are, after all, often found in Shakespeare's plays, and they are also very good at causing drama, so that's all good. And that's it! My throat is very sore. I hope that you enjoyed this analysis and that I didn't miss anything. Again, please let me know if I did. I'm gonna do a bonus on the other characters of the play, because there's a lot of secondary and even primary characters from the play that are not present in The Sims, even though they're super interesting, so that could give you inspiration for baby names. And after that video, we should be done with Romeo and Juliet. Then next episode, we are going to talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream. Yes, I'm postponing the Taming of the Shrew until further notice. Maybe it will happen right after Midsummer Night's Dream, maybe not, but it will happen. It's just that there are important links between Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream, so it makes sense to do one after the other. In that episode, we'll talk about Titania, Oberon, Puck, Bottom, and Hermia. So I hope that you're excited for that, and I'll talk to you later. Have a good day, bye!